Scotland is changing. What kind of country could we become? Let me show you. Come with me as I explore Scotland's powerful and inspiring wee European neighbours. What vision do they offer of a brighter future for Scotland? Norway, a country that many Scots would once have seen as a twin nation. We have the same population, much the same geography. We share the oil and fish of the North Sea, and parts of Scotland are closer to Norway than to London. But over the last 200 years, the paths have diverged. Over that time, Norway has amassed the world's largest sovereign wealth fund with its oil and is regularly at the top of every international league table. It's the world's best democracy, it's the world's most equal nation. So what is Scotland to learn from Norway, and might the paths of the twins once again converge? Equality starts in unexpected places here, like the ubiquitous wooden weekend hut. Well, we're here in Linoya, which is one of 3 little islands, only 10 minutes from the centre of Oslo, which is covered in lots of tiny huts. They were given to working class people way back in 1922, and they've been staying in those families ever since, because people would give their eye teeth before they give up houses here. They're absolutely beautiful. They're occupied really only for the summer months, but those summer months are like jewels in people's lives. They camp out here for 2 to 3 months at a time, only going back for what they really have to go back for. And this is actually typical of Norwegian life. The hut is almost the permanent home for people. It's the one they never change when they change where they live in the city. And it's become a really focal part of keeping people sane, keeping families together, having something to live for at the weekend. And it's sadly something Scots just do not have. I've come to see old friends Tuta and Ola Norman to hear more about Norway's hutting culture. Have you been here all summer?
Yes, from April.
April?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and over 30 degrees Celsius.
We have the most lovely summer since 1947.
Yes, yes, we've had the same.
Yeah.
And this is now September, so how many months is that you've been here? 5 months?
5 months, yeah.
Yeah.
Goodness.
Half
half
year
a year.
here, half year home.
This is beautiful. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I've been researching
Yes.
your island for
Yeah.
8 years.
Yeah.
And it is like a little paradise here,
Yeah.
isn't it,
Yeah, it
really?
Yes.
You know you're living in paradise.
Yeah, we know.
It's clear that easy access to land and a century equalising income means most folk have a simple place to escape to after work and a higher quality of life all round.
When the government began to talk about this, they said they were so glad for that the working people from this place will go out and have fresh air and everything. They have something to do with the health. So therefore, they get the place for the hut.
Most people who live here, are they still the descendants of
Yes,
the original
the
people?
the most of
Most of
us are there.
Because people in Scotland would be amazed that someone who comes from a working family could have a little hut somewhere, because that is impossible in Scotland, really.
It's a lot of huts in Norway. Every Norman, every hut have a hut. We say
Almost, yeah.
almost, yes, somewhere in the mountain, with the sea. Yeah,
When you come here, what do you do?
Fishing. Fixing the hut.
Yes.
There's always something to do.
there's always something to do. I have a walk around the island every day.
Every day.
With some girlfriends of mine. We are the same age and we have been here always. And we go every day.
This is quite a small but perfectly formed hut.
Yeah.
You have 4 bedrooms upstairs.
One time there was 18 person there.
18.
18
Right.
persons.
Wow.
Yeah. The hut, you cannot set a price on the hut. We cannot that, because if they gave me 10 millions from the hut, for the hut, what shall I do then? I don't have use for 10 millions, but I have use for the hut to be to family to friends and people and have a good life and a good time. That's not money.
Can you imagine living in a country where you don't, and no one has huts?
No.
No, I can't.
Can't imagine it.
No, I can't.
So do you think we could ever get you to come to visit in Scotland?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to
Yes.
visit, yes.
To live?
No. No way. Norway is the best.
But the ancestors of Tuta and Ola did visit Scotland 1,000 years ago, and the evidence that they stayed is carried in our DNA.
I've been studying DNA for the last 25 years of my life, and I think it's really, really interesting because we inherit it from our ancestors. So we can use DNA as a record of the past that's written inside every one of us.
Dr. Jim Wilson from Edinburgh University has made a detailed study of Scotland's DNA heritage.
When we look at Scottish DNA, we can see quite a variety of influences from many different sources. We see very strong evidence of links to Norway in Shetland, in Orkney, and to a lesser degree in Caithness and in the Western Isles and Northwest Coast, round into Argyll, to the islands of Argyll. We see strong signatures, particularly on the male side of the DNA, of Scandinavian ancestry, particularly Norse ancestry. And this ties in very well with the history of these parts of Scotland. The Norsemen came to the Northern Isles around about 700, 800 AD, and they set up a polity there, a jarldom. The county Sutherland is named, despite being one of the northernmost counties of Britain, is named Sutherland because it's the southern land as viewed from Orkney. So although these places are quite remote today, they were of somewhat more importance back in that time. Over time, more Scottish people moved there, and many of the natives' land was taken away and given to incoming lowland Scots, and the population thus hybridized, resulting in the populations that we see today.
Norway takes democracy and press freedom very seriously. Unlike Scotland, all papers are owned by companies based inside Norway, and the state subsidises the press in small remote towns and cities, including papers like the left-wing Klassenkampen.
I work as a subscription seller for Klassenkampen. Klassenkampen means the class struggle.
As someone who works in the media, I've seen the rapid decline of newspaper circulation in Scotland. So one of the most impressive things about Norway is state funding for the press. Elizabeth Eide of Oslo Metropolitan University explains. Well, let's start with the press support system. Does the state support newspapers?
They do, actually, and they support some newspapers more than others. And that has to do, I think, with the idea of diversity and democracy. Diversity, in two senses, both that, at least in the past, it should be media from different political leanings, but since we've done away with the party press now, it would be more newspapers with different worldviews, such as in Norway now we have, for example, two Christian-leaning newspapers who receive a lot of support. We have one, let's say, agriculturally inclined paper, which receives a lot of support, and we have one rather radical paper called The Class Struggle, which I think is rather unique in Europe for its roots in the Maoist movement, but now non-sectarian and broad-based, which also receives a lot of millions. The system is rooted in the idea that a small nation cannot make alive such a big system of newspapers without support. So it has very strong democratic arguments to it.
And it will be surprising to some people as well that class struggle paper, Klassenkampen, is obviously a left-wing paper financed by a state which is run by a conservative-led government.
Yeah, and but this conservative-led government, you can say in Norway, we have a rather centrist kind of policy system, except that, of course, there is a rather right-wing, extreme right-wing party part of that government, and they have questioned the press support system for a long time. But there is a rather large consensus still that the system has to go on, although it might come in a different shape because of the digitalization of newspapers nowadays. It goes to very local newspapers as well. Because Norway, as you know, even if we're not much more than 5 million, we have very many small communities where people like to know what's going on and what the neighbors are doing and how the local industry is doing. And so the diversity also is a geographical diversity. The subscription paper, of course, Aftenposten, is the largest and also by way of print.
But that's interesting because Aftenposten has come down to 200,000. Our big papers, the Scotsman and the Herald, are on about 20 or 35,000.
Well, you know, VG used to have more than 300,000 copies a day.
That's like 10. Your idea of bad news is 10 times better than ours.
No, but our history is a history of being one of the most newspaper-reading countries in the world. I think maybe surpassed or sidelined by Japan, I read. But we definitely have a sort of history of reading newspapers and listening to radio. I mean, very sort of media-savvy people, in a sense.
Maybe it's time for a wee history lesson. In 1814, the Danes went into the Napoleonic War behind Napoleon. Big mistake. He was beaten, the Danes were beaten, and they lost territory, including Norway. The Norwegian prince hoped the country might be independent and summoned 112 men to write a constitution. It gave the vote to every male adult landowner. And so many Norwegians owned land that 45% of those men got the vote overnight. Norway was reluctantly forced into a union of crowns under the King of Sweden, but its radical constitution meant the path to independence had already begun. At the heart of Norway's society is the Storting, the Norwegian Parliament. So Thea, we're in the former second chamber of the Parliament, but in a way the kind of most important thing seems to be not in this room at all. It's in a vault downstairs.
Yes.
This is the Constitution.
So our constitution marks the year and the day we actually got to begin having a democracy. We got our own institutions. We wrote down originally that we were going to be a sovereign country after several hundred years in a union with Denmark. We also wrote down some basic human rights and that people, at least men above 25 years old, owning a certain amount of land or property or being businessmen or officials, getting the right to vote for who they wanted to be the members of parliament. So we actually celebrate the 17th of May, the year when we crowned a Danish prince to be the king of a sovereign Norway and signed the constitution.
That constitution also effectively banned nobility.
Yes. We wrote down that Norway shouldn't have a nobility, even though some already had or were noble. They could only continue to have their titles, but their sons and daughters could not heir that title.
When you roll on, what was happening in that long century up to independence with the Parliament?
Even though we were under the union with Sweden, we had our own parliament, and for that period of time up until independence, we created our own parliament building, but we also had this ever-going disputes with the King of Sweden, in a way, trying to figure out how to run our country without too much influence from the Swedish king.
What else did the Parliament spend money on before they built their own building?
They spent money on building the University of Oslo, which you can see down the roads. They also spent money on building an asylum, a hospital, and so on. So they really chose to look out rather than building their own building first.
That's really fascinating, actually.
Yeah.
So once it was established, the Norwegian Parliament was having a lot of battles with the Swedish king, and it seemed to be winning most of them.
Yeah, already from the beginning, we actually were trying to stop the Swedish king to get more influence over Norwegian politics by having this constitutional conservatism, you could say, not changing anything from the original constitution. But I would also like to mention two other important battles that we had. The first one was the Battle of Parliamentarianism, which we had this breakthrough in 1884, when the Norwegian parliament got through that the cabinet, which were under the Swedish king, had to meet in the Norwegian parliament. And in that way, we, in some ways, actually had that the cabinet were vested in the Norwegian parliament in a way.
So that must have been a clumsy period when you had a Norwegian cabinet and a Swedish cabinet.
Yeah.
And yet it was part of the process of pulling power away from the Swedish king and the whole Swedish state.
Yes.
What was the other, that one that you were mentioning?
The other I would like to mention is how Norwegian, with the quite big merchant navy, wanted to have a bigger influence on the foreign policy, which was under the Swedish king at that time. So what they wanted was to establish different consulates around the world. This was, of course, not something that the Swedes wanted. So that actually was the one event that sparked the dissolvement of the Union, because they won that battle too. And also because we have had good bonds, even though we have had these quarrels and arguments and battles, you could say. So when the Norwegian parliament called for referendum, and you had this tremendous majority for going out of the union with Sweden, of course this led the Swedish king having to accept. More than 300,000 women signed that they wanted to go out of the union with Sweden. And when you compare that to the only 368,000 men actually voting in the referendum, you see that it's a massive, massive engagement from the women throughout.
So why do you think there was such overwhelming belief that Norway could become an independent country? Because when it did, I think it was the second poorest country in Europe.
Very good question. And even though I don't have the exact answer to that, I would definitely guess that we had been a sovereign country in a way, because we had our own institutions, we had our own systems, we had our own university. It wasn't this huge dissolvement. What was lacking was a royal family, or at least a head of state.
And after that, you actually introduced proportional representation
Yes.
very early compared to Britain.
In 1921, yeah.
So that's almost 100 years of proportional representation.
Yeah.
Which means 100
right.
years of compromise, negotiation, coalition, all these things.
Yes.
Do you think that's had an impact on your society?
Definitely. Now having 9 different parties represented in the parliament, consisting of only 169 members, of course it has an impact of how you always had to negotiate, but I think it has had more political impact than anything else.
Have Norwegians ever had any doubt that they would be a successful independent country?
Looking at the numbers from the referendum, it doesn't look like it.
And one of its biggest success stories is Norwegian public transport. There are 9 tram routes which cross Oslo and reach into the suburbs. Edinburgh, eat your heart out. Tickets are relatively cheap, and it's another way of ensuring equality. Even professionals don't actually own cars. Folk like academic Nick Brandel. We took the number 17 tram to Oslo University.
You're a big Everton fan?
Yes.
Right, so you know how bad British transport can be. So how do you rate this?
Well, Oslo is very good, very good. There's a debate on whether the tram is like the way of the future or whether it's a thing of the past, whether we should replace it with buses, which is a much more efficient way of transporting people.
But you've got all these choices, because you also have as well as these trams, you also have the underground train, and there's even proposals to build a new tunnel to make more underground.
They have to build a new tunnel because it's totally overcrowded at the moment. They cannot fit more trains into the existing system. So if they want to make it more efficient, they have to build both a new tunnel for the underground and for the trains.
And this is, of course, where Norway comes into its own, because you are the great tunnel builders, aren't you?
Yes and no, or rather in two ways. Yes, we build tunnels, but it also takes a long time. So it's been in the planning for at least a decade, and it's probably going to take at least a decade more before it's finished.
Really?
Things take time within this system because we debate and we include people and vested interest into the eventual outcome to make it more stable.
Right, so gosh, that's pretty impressive. And in the meantime, everyone will just be on crowded trams.
It took us 40 years to build an airport. But the airport is brilliant.
Oh, it's a stoter, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. How does this system help you in your daily life?
Well, without such an efficient system, you would obviously have to have a car or depend on someone who had a car. And I mean, one of the downsides in Norway is the lack of sort of these public space. Like there's no piazzas really. So the public transport system also is kind of a place for socializing in a way which we don't so often do.
So we've arrived here at the university, and we're joined by Øyvind Brakberg, who's a senior lecturer in politics, and by Louise, who is the new addition to the Brakberg family. I'm very grateful to the two of you. What we're trying to do here, it may not be possible, is to unwrap Norway. We were cousins, we are genetically linked.
I think there is a strong historical argument for pointing to sort of a relationship or a sense of familiarity between Scotland and Norway. The idea that both of us were sort of, it's just the North Sea between us. We were both small, fairly egalitarian, fairly patriotic nations, if you like, outward-oriented economies depending on the open seas, and at the same time subjugated to a stronger neighbour. In the Norwegian case, it would be in part Denmark and then later Sweden that we were sort of unwillingly, if you like, unionized with. This historical argument could then be used to say that we are cousins, so we share so many similarities, yet history or certain choices made during our history has pushed us onto different paths. In cultural terms, Norway is very much shaped by choices taken during our history, which has made us different as a society from what Scotland has been able to become. I think is the safest conclusion. Scotland could have become something similar as a society by now, if you like. But then you would have needed a different trajectory, different choices, different ways of organizing the welfare state and the broader economy during the 20th century. And in order to do so, one needs full autonomy or sovereignty. Scotland didn't have that at the time, which meant that you were very much affected by choices made in London in terms of how the economy should be organized and society and democracy should be. It's as simple as that, I think, that our model emerged through specific historical choices, milestones and trajectories that Scotland simply couldn't take.
Can I reassure my honourable friend that we have confirmed that when we bring forward the vote on the final deal, we'll ensure that Parliament is presented with the appropriate analysis to make an informed decision.
Many people take a fascination in Westminster simply due to its antiquity and its sort of theatrical aspects and the sense of leadership that you know who's in charge and who will be who will be up against the wall in a way when things go rough. It's a fascinating play that unfolds, and it's also a form of democracy that we're being taught about at school as something that was historically important. But it's not contemporarily updated. And in that sense, the Scottish emerging democratic model is much closer to the Scandinavian one.
Norway is in a kind of halfway house arrangement with the European Union. I think a poll suggested only 18% of Norwegians want to be full members of the EU. Why not?
It's a strange compromise. In terms of historical identity, we've very much defined ourselves as divided from continental Europe, if that sounds familiar. The notion that we're different, and if you add the simple observation that our independence is fairly recent, although it's been there for a century now, the idea was that we need our sovereignty, we need to guard our sovereignty. But our economy has always been outward-oriented, international and European, so we need to be part of that market too. So the compromise was that we tried to join the market whilst avoiding the political institutions involved. So that is the compromise. It's an uneasy one, but the alternatives have been seen as worse in Norway.
And after all that serious thinking, a little fun with language. So Scotland and Norway, they say, are very different countries, different languages, but are they? I've got Matilda here who's going to prove a few things for me. Okay then, mouse in Norwegian.
Mus.
House.
Hus.
Woman.
Kvinne.
Which is like quine, which we say in the north of Scotland.
Yes.
Dirty.
Møkkete.
Which is a bit like mocket in Glasgow for dirty. The great one is, what's a vacuum cleaner?
Støvsuger.
So that's a støvsuger. Any Scot would understand that one straight off there. Well, I think that's enough actually. That's quite a lot in common. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, this is my favourite place in Oslo. It's the National Gallery, and in it you see the most incredible depictions of the way that Oslo life was just before Norwegian independence. And particularly here you see paintings by Krog, and this was telling the Norwegians stories about themselves, on the one hand of their Viking past and the incredible capacity they had, and on the other, the terrible poverty being experienced by street children in Oslo under Swedish rule. You know, what's really impressive about all of this is that there's these epic pictures and portrayals of nature here, massive mountains with all their undulation, their physicality, and people. And I've got to tell you, my heart leaps to come into this place because it's not like Scotland where you have empty landscapes portrayed by nothing but the monarch of the glen, the sole deer, around which all the glens had been cleared of actual Scots. This is a place where people, landscape, farms, logging, rivers, everything coexists. And that's because in actual history, it always has. And this picture is so vivid, you feel you're almost there. Norway and Scotland both have big rivers and a massive potential for hydropower. But Norway got off the mark almost half a century earlier than us because its new independent government didn't let landowners block the development of cheap energy for all. I'm here at Labro Falls, one of the first hydro dams in the whole of Norway, built around 1910, to hear more of the story from the curator of its museum, Ole Jakob Krone.
When they started building power stations, we had just become independent from the union with first Denmark and then Sweden. And I think they wanted to make the power stations impressing, just to make a point for the new state. With hydroelectric power, we were going to build the country. And here they brought in one of the most famous architects at the time to build it.
So this is kind of like a palace, this?
Yeah, sure.
But hydropower did more than just impress Norwegians. It transformed the country, keeping industry almost everywhere, not just in Oslo, keeping people on the land, putting huge amounts of money into local councils which own the hydro resource, and let them build bridges, schools, tunnels and other infrastructure, even in the most remote places. Norway's slogan is powered by nature. It's not wrong.
But they had started earlier. They started in the middle of the 19th century by building factories and placing all the factories by the waterfalls where the power was. But then at the end of the century you started making hydroelectric power and sending it from one place to another. This power station was actually built to give power to Drammen.
But Drammen, why are you sending it to Drammen?
Because Drammen hasn't got any waterfalls, so they had to get power from other places. So they bought waterfalls in the nearby area. Oslo did just the same.
So this waterfall and this dam and this hydro complex here in Kongsberg basically was supplying Drammen down the river.
Yeah.
And the thing that's significant too is that you needed to own the river. The state needed to own the river before you could dam it, do things with it.
Yeah.
And the state actually took back control from private owners.
Foreigners started to get interested in Norwegian waterfalls and started to buy them. And the government realized that if this continued, they would lose the control. So they started making laws to get the control back.
And were some of those people that had bought the rivers up, were they British industrialists?
They were British and Swedish, as far as I remember, yeah.
And overall, what is the impact of hydro in Norway? Because actually, Norwegians don't really use the oil and gas from your oil fields. Most things here are powered by hydro.
Yeah. Well, it meant everything. If you look at, if you go to the Vestlandet, the western coast, you have large factories there which make, for instance, aluminium. And they are placed there because of the waterfalls, and you got cheap electricity. And this was industry which was very power demanding, and it was built by cheap electric power. Here everything is spread around the country. It has been a point for the Norwegian government to have people living all over the country, in small places and big places, and to keep up the population everywhere. And I think that's very good.
So what do you see in Scotland then?
Well, obviously we are gathering in some places where very many people live, and then you have vast landscapes where it's empty.
Stavanger, west of Oslo, is Norway's third largest city and its oil capital. The Petroleum Fund means every Norwegian's benefited from oil exploration, and that sense of national pride in their engineering achievements is reflected in this large, sassy and popular oil museum.
This is the Troll platform, the concrete deep water structure. So it's the biggest thing that is moved on Earth.
Everybody seems fascinated by this exhibit. What's the guide explaining?
The guide is explaining about the big catastrophe in 1980 when the Alexander Kielland platform capsized in the North Sea. It is the biggest working accident in Norway's history.
It's great in a way to see you're not giving us just the PR version of oil. I mean, there are accidents as well as spectacular engineering feats.
Yeah, the oil industry, it can be dangerous. You know that as well. So, yeah, I think it's natural to tell the story about it. The first numbers here are the Norwegian Petroleum Fund. And this is today's oil price, $77. And it's how much that's produced every day. It's about the society as well.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. And also how it affects the people.
that oil isn't just an industrial process for Norway, is it?
No, it is of great value to our economy, of course. And we have built a welfare state in Norway because of the oil.
Do you know, we haven't really got a big oil museum in Scotland, and I kind of get the feeling that people are more proud of their industrial heritage and their oil production here in Norway. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I heard that before. I think it's true. Yeah, I don't know why people in Scotland are not so proud of their industry, but yeah.
But you are.
Yeah, we are. But in the later years, it's a bit turned upside down because of the concern about climate and everything. Oil isn't that popular anymore.
Really? Do you see that in the museum? Are people coming in saying, actually, why are you glorifying oil, or what do they say?
Yeah, we don't try to glorify it. We have an exhibition about energy and climate as well in the museum. And we are going to make a new exhibition updated about energy and climate. So we think it's important for us to have a concern about these things as well.
And that change towards renewables is already underway. Stavanger's also the headquarters of Statoil, the state-owned company that undertook most North Sea exploration. Now called Equinor to reflect its new green energy investments, Erik Varnes is its chief economist and senior vice president.
When we decided the main frameworks around the politics around the oil industry back in the early 70s, there were some very visionary, both the bureaucrats but also politicians, that saw that if this grew and became big, we need framework conditions where we make sure that we have the right incentives, but at the same time also make sure that most of the value creation ends up in the Norwegian state. And the Norwegian state owns the resources, right? So we already in 1975 we introduced an income tax with a marginal rate of around 75%. We still have that. We have 78% marginal income tax rate on oil. And that was then. It was also clear that in order to make that work, it had to be an income tax system. That means that the government is also taking an extreme risk when the price falls, right? I mean, because you can deduct all your costs against the same tax rate as well. So there was a period during the 70s and 80s when this industry grew, and it was basically all about investments. We hadn't got any of the revenues yet, right? So the deficits and the net debt of the Norwegian state as a consequence of that grew significantly. But that was part of a conscious decision that we, if we're going to have the income, we need to take part of the cost and take the risk. Then, late 90s, the oil industry was starting to mature. We had made the Troll discovery and then the Troll field, which is an enormous giant gas. The revenues became enormous. And as a consequence then, of course, of a 78% tax rate, we have the direct ownership in the company called Statoil, and then also the direct ownership that they have in the licenses. It was clear that public revenues were going to explode. And then in order to isolate the discussions on the state budget every year from the fact that they had so much money, the parliament decided itself that we need to put this money aside in a fund. And then we only discuss how much we take out of the fund every year to balance the state budget. And that's the mechanism of the Petroleum Wealth Fund. So all the revenues, all the state revenues from oil, which is then tax, its direct ownership, etc., goes into the fund in the bank, central bank. And then you transfer money back to the state budget if you need it to balance the budget. And for a very long period, I mean, it was very small amounts. We didn't reduce the other taxes. I mean, I pay as much income taxes as anybody in the rest of the world. Norwegians pay the same income taxes. We have the world's highest gasoline prices and gasoline taxes. We have a relatively high VAT compared to the rest of Europe. So our system is as if we didn't have oil, almost. And then the Norwegian parliamentarians have allowed themselves to spend slightly, I should say, a lot more in the public sector, also because of the security from the oil fund. So we're running a public deficit, if you like, every year, which is then financed by the returns of the fund. That system has worked enormously well. We as economists are a little bit worried about what that does when it becomes, because now it's become extremely visible. Every Norwegian knows that, you know, we have 8,000, 9,000 billion Norwegian kroners, about 1 trillion American dollars in the bank. And you divide that by 5 million people and you get a lot of money. So what does it do to our willingness to work, to our understanding that we have to pay normal taxes, etc., and to the willingness to save those money for the coming generations? And we see signals in the Norwegian economic policy debate that, you know, that some things might change here.
I don't know if you've followed much of the debate in Britain and Scotland, but when there was an independence referendum 4 years ago, there was a lot made of how difficult it would be for Scotland to have oil, because it would make our economy very volatile, ups and downs, and that we would find it very hard to exist like that as an independent country. But you seem to have managed.
Yes, we have managed. Well, of course, just the process of becoming independent is a difficult process in and by itself, being so integrated as you are to another country. And what we are, of course, in Norway is also extremely vulnerable to the ups and downs of the expanded oil industry, if you like. It's not only the oil companies, but I mean, most people work in the supply industry. Of course, the mechanism of having a large public sector, having a large petroleum wealth fund gives the Norwegian politicians an instrument whereby they can compensate for some of those variations. And if you look at how the financial crisis hit Norway, you can hardly notice. And one of the reasons was, of course, we had this buffer that we could actually employ. So it's, but you need to have an acceptance where you have these automatic stabilizers caused by high taxes as well, right? I mean, it's not only the oil industry's taxes, but it's also all of us being Norwegians paying relatively high taxes. That works very well with a volatile market because the state carries part of the risks for us.
Do you think it's too late for Scotland to have some similar kind of fund like this from the massive expansion of renewables that we're expecting to see?
Yeah, I think that's also one of the discussions here, and I think it's relatively clear that we can never expect the same type of profitability on renewables as we did or do on oil and gas. It's two very different kinds of resources. If you were to have a petroleum wealth fund or that type of fund, energy fund, it would have to be based on something else than renewables. And then maybe in terms of the UK oil and gas industry, the oil and gas sector might be so mature that you couldn't expect the same type of profitability as we've seen in our sector. We're a social democracy where we have very strong labor unions, we have very strong traditions for cooperation. We've had very strong political systems handling changes and across the spectrum, basically, between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. And we lucked out. I mean, we had a strong industrial base, partly driven by the hydroelectricity industry, then the shipping industry. We're one of the world's largest shipping nations in terms of flags still. And we had a shipbuilding industry. And we had spare capacity in that industry just when we needed it for the oil and gas industry, right? So we transformed some of these shipyards into supply hubs for the oil and gas industry, and they started building platforms instead of vessels. We see large opportunities now, and we get large opportunities now to develop both a new oil field in one of the largest, the Mariner field, one of the largest industrial developments taking place in Scotland at the moment. I think we have about 2,000 people involved now in the finishing of the platform. That will produce oil for a very long period. We've been given the opportunity for offshore wind. UK is our largest base for that, offshore wind, and in Scotland in particular now we're testing out floating windmills. We have a big office in Aberdeen and a lot of activities going out there, so I hope that will continue.
Some tough messages there about the need for a new independent country to tax fairly and think beyond oil. But also something really significant. Even the energy-rich Norwegians are coming to Scotland to develop their renewables, Our resources are that good. Scotland has 85% of Britain's hydropower, a quarter of Europe's tidal energy, and a tenth of its wave power. Offshore wind could soon provide half our energy needs. That's why Scottish Powers dropped fossil fuels to concentrate solely on wind. 2/3 of Scotland's energy needs were met by this renewables mix in 2017, way ahead of the UK average. And we're not done yet. The seeds of the next green energy revolution are already being laid in the industrial city of Drammen near Oslo, and its world-beating heat pump technology comes from Scotland.
In the factory here, we're making the large heat pumps, essentially traditional Scottish engineering.
Can you tell us what you're actually doing in Drammen that's so special?
Oil and gas in Norway, they export it rather than burning it themselves. So in order to do the heating for the houses, they have heat pumps. In the case of Drammen, they have a district heating scheme, which is a network of pipes around the city under the pavements. But they have to make the heat in a central energy station, and to do that they use a large refrigeration system that we manufactured for them. And that's basically harvesting heat from the seawater, boosting it up in temperature and delivering it into the pipes at 90 degrees. We get 3 units of heat for every 1 unit of electricity that we consume. Any of the other competition were probably 20 to 25% less heat output. So they save money and they save the environment at the same time. At the moment, most of the buildings have gas. We could be harvesting the heat from our rivers. There's 8 times as much heat in the River Clyde as is required for the entire centre of Glasgow. So that's a huge resource.
What's stopping us?
Good question. I think some of it is economics, a lot of it is policy. There's really no incentive for people to stop burning gas in their buildings, and they think it's cheap and convenient. Clearly our broader climate ambitions to decarbonise pretty much 100% within 20-25 years, it's just not compatible. We have to find a different way of doing it. That comes down to policy to really strongly encourage people to do that. It just doesn't exist at the moment.
Many people feel that Scotland missed the boat economically the first time round with oil. Have we got a chance, Scotland, with renewables second time around?
Yes, we do. We have to take it though. The biggest mistake would be to miss the boat again. We're sitting here as essentially doing stuff that's ahead of the world, and we'll let it slip if we don't really grab it and make it absolutely central to our policy in Scotland to do clean heating.
Is that possible to do as part of the UK?
Well, we've got to get to the crux of the problem and take the tough decisions and do it for everybody's benefit. And that, I think, is a better chance of happening in Scotland.
When people say that Scotland is the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy, are they right?
Even more right than they realise. This isn't about just being better for the global environment, and it's not just about being better for the local environment in terms of pollution, and it's not just about being better for the economics of not buying so much fossil fuel from abroad. It's about creating jobs locally, and the number of jobs that we would create if we tried to do what I said, which was all of the centre of Glasgow and Edinburgh and Perth and so on, would far exceed the number of jobs in the oil and gas industry.
So, can Scotland follow Norway's lead and use energy to support independence as they did 100 years ago? Is the Scottish case at all similar to Norway back in 1905? Here's Øyvind Bratberg again.
Small state nationalism comes in different guises, in different forms, and what you can say about the Scottish form of nationalism seen from the outside is that it's definitely non-ethnic and it's non-discriminatory. It's civic in nature, based upon the willingness to give people voice and to find a different sort of model for society to pursue. It's easy to sympathize with that notion, and it's also easy to see that it wouldn't necessarily lead to any form of domino effect or sort of nationalist scares that people tend to point to in European history. The Scottish case is fairly close to the sort of Pacific, small state, civic, outward-oriented form of nationalism that Norway has been characterized by historically. And we also, sort of, in terms of nation building, we share the admiration for some of the same traditions in our own history. So Scottish nationalism is not a dangerous phenomenon from that point of view.
We seem to have missed the boat in the 18th century and the 19th, but will we miss it again?
Patience might be the word, although it's an irritating notion that you need patience. At least what the Norwegian case illustrates is that you need sort of the timing must be right in terms of actually obtaining independence, and beyond the sort of the formal notion of independence, you need to develop a model, if you like, that is sustainable in economic terms and in terms of sort of support and engagement from below. This is something that works fairly well in Scandinavia. You have sort of the structures in place, so you don't need to go around thinking about all the time, what is it to be a Norwegian, what is it to be egalitarian. It's just embedded in the structures somehow. And we've been very, very lucky with choices made during our history. And you'll need to do things incrementally, build stone upon stone, and then find that the timing is right in terms of obtaining independence. One would think that Brexit provides potentially a critical juncture for making the leap towards independence.
Whatever your views on it, do you think Scotland could become independent? You never mind whether it's a good idea or not. Do you think Scotland as an economy and a people are capable of running an independent country?
There's no shortcoming on the Scottish side that would bar the road towards independence. There are things that need to be established, obviously ranging from diplomatic service to sort of full-fledged domestic institutions and so on. And divorce itself might be a complicated matter. But beyond that, I can't see any fundamental barrier towards Scotland becoming a successful state. I think the path would be a well-trodden one.
And of course, if Scotland remains in a stifling, stagnating constitutional grind, there's the danger young folk will follow another well-trodden path out of this country altogether. Tassie and Scott looked all over Scotland in vain for an affordable bit of land to call their own. When they failed, these two creatives headed east to Kongsberg, a town of 23,000 people west of Oslo, with its own powerful council. Scotland has 32 councils, Norway has 422 for the same population. That means small town and island life in Norway is vital and viable.
So you guys are actually in a very good position to be able to see the difference between a Scottish normal and a Norwegian normal. You know, for example, your house is pretty fabby.
We're renting this place and this is considered to be almost like a hutta for a lot of Norwegians.
Home is really important for Norwegians, you know, so for them it would be crazy not to own your own house. Most homeowners are in their 20s in their first house. Yeah.
Kindergarten.
Most parents go back to work after the child is 1 year old, and that's due to the big support in childcare. So when you pay for barnehage or the kindergarten or nursery, or you pay for after school care, that's subsidised by the government, and that's to make sure both parents are back out in the working environment.
You're very involved in arts. Arts funding, do you have to kind of kill to get it?
It's very, very generous. I think I nearly fell off my studio stool when I saw what you could apply for. They have a big, strong feeling that it's part of the wealth and health of society. So they put a lot aside for artists to apply for funding.
Could you expect here to have a job and a farm?
They own their land, they have animals, livestock, sometimes crops, very often orchards, and they'll also be a school teacher in the local school. There is a very strong thing in the Norwegian culture of self-determination, and that has come from generations back. You know, they're farmers and fishermen. If you don't fix the boat won't sail and you won't eat, and they still have that. This town has only 23,000 folk, and it's managed by the kommune, the municipal council for this area. Yeah, you really notice that there's a huge amount of people power.
Is it possible to have a good career here and not leave for Oslo?
The amount of communication, the amount of tunnels and bridges and ferries and super fast broadband means that there are businesses that I know. I have colleagues right up in the far north, and they're busy making films, making animations, and they're getting on with really international business, and they live in a tiny town of maybe 300, 400 people.
There's no feudal landowners?
No.
So it's mostly farmers that own the land or the commune?
Unlike us, the majority of Norway's land is owned by the people of Norway.
Everything's very open. So if you're interested in a bit of land, you think nothing's going on with it, you can click on the internet and find out exactly who owns it very, very quickly within 5-10 minutes. And every bit of land's got its own unique identification code, which is fantastic. So there's no hiding behind things, there's no, vagueness, and so land gets used here.
So the thing everyone watching wants to know is, are you going to come back?
We kind of ended up here, thought it might be an experiment, said, we'd really like to strengthen this connection we have with our neighbours. We're a very, very innovative nation, Scotland. We're a nation of inventors and very creative people, because we've not owned anything. And the only thing we own is up here. So it makes us inventors, engineers, and we're almost the best in the world at it.
Do you think, from what you've seen about how an independent country actually works and thrives, do you think Scotland can do it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
like yesterday, just get on with it. Don't wait. It's waiting for you.
My colleagues they just don't understand how or why, They're
like, why?
Why are you not independent already? There's obviously a mindset that's affected Scotland deeply. When you come here, you can see there's no difference. We could do this easily.
Norway and Scotland, the twin nations, have gone on very different paths over recent centuries. The Norwegians came out of a union with Denmark a century after Scotland had gone into one with Britain. And the Norwegians have done pretty well on their own with independence coming in 1905. Right from the beginning, they had their own constitution. Because land was owned so widely, it meant that millions of Norwegians got the vote. That peasants' parliament reshaped Norway completely as a thriving democracy from the early days. They had hydroelectricity, which kept the money in municipalities, kept people on the land, and brought industry to areas all over Norway, not concentrated in one city. And then, of course, it created a template for oil, which was put into a sovereign wealth fund, which is banked for the future of Norway's wealth. In Scotland, we missed that opportunity. As part of the UK, we had to watch while Margaret Thatcher spent the money on privatisations and frittered our future away. The result is that Scotland, oil-rich and energy-rich, has become a place with chronic inequality, with grinding poverty, and with terrible health outcomes. This surely can be different. Scotland missed the boat on oil, but it's not too late to have a second chance. Renewable energy gives a chance for the twin nations to combine once again for a future that cannot be dependent on oil or fossil fuels, but on the renewables in which Scotland is so rich, and the technology which is already being developed here to exploit that for the whole world. That's the potential, and that surely is the destiny of Scotland. The question is whether you think we can reach that destiny as part of the current constitutional setup, or whether there is a far better future with independence.